This is Volume 1, Part 2 of the New and Complete Newgate Calendar, read by Roy Schreiber. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Circumstantial Account of the Life, Trial, Piracies, and Execution of Captain John Kidd, who was hanged at Execution Dock. The case of Captain Kidd, while in agitation, engaged the attention of the public in a very eminent degree, though the man himself was one of the most contemptible of the human race. The town of Greenock in Scotland gave birth to Captain Kidd, who was bred to the sea, and having quitted his native country, he resided at New York, where he became the owner of a small vessel, with which he traded among the pirates, obtained a thorough knowledge of their haunts, and could give a better account of them than any other person whatever. He was neither remarkable for the excels of his courage, nor for the want of it. In a word, his ruling passion appeared to be avarice, and to this was owing his connection with the pirates. When Kidd was in company with these abandoned people, he used to converse and act as they did. Yet at other times he would make singular professions of honesty, and intimate how easy a matter it would be to extirpate these people and prevent their making future depredations. His frequent remarks of this kind engaged the notice of several considerable planters, who formed a more favourable idea of him than his true character would warrant, and procured him the patronage with which he was afterwards honoured. Before we enter into further particulars respecting this man, it would be proper to say something of the situation of public affairs previous to and at the time he began to grow conspicuous. For years past great complaints had been made of the piracies committed in the West Indies, which had been greatly encouraged by some of the inhabitants of North America, on account of the advantage that could be made by the purchase of effects thus fraudulently obtained. This coming to the knowledge of King William III, he, in the year 1695, bestowed the government of New England and New York on the Earl of Bellomont, an Irish nobleman of distinguished character and abilities. As soon as his Majesty had conferred this honour on Lord Bellomont, his lordship began to consider of the most effectual method to redress the evils complained of, and he represented to Colonel Levingston, a gentleman who had great property in New York, that some proper steps should be taken to obviate the evils so long complained of. Just at this juncture Captain Kidd was arrived from New York in a sloop of his own. Him, therefore, the colonel mentioned to Lord Bellomont as a bold and daring man, who was very fit to be employed against the pirates, as he was perfectly well acquainted with the places which they resorted at. This plan met with the fullest approbation of his lordship, who, knowing how desirous the king was that this nest of pirates should be destroyed, mentioned the affair to his Majesty, who greatly applauded the design, and recommended it to the notice of the Board of Admiralty. The commissioners likewise approved it, but such were then the hurry and confusion of public affairs that, though the design was approved, no steps were taken towards carrying it into execution. The transactions on this head being imparted to Colonel Levingston, he made an application to Lord Bellomont, and informed him that, as the affair would not well admit of delay, it was worthy of being undertaken by some private persons of rank and distinction, and carried into execution at their own expense, notwithstanding public encouragement was denied it. Lord Bellomont approved of this project, but it was attended with considerable difficulty. At length, however, the Lord Chancellor Somers, the Duke of Shrewsbury, the Earl of Romney, the Earl of Oxford, and some other persons, with Colonel Levingston and Captain Kidd, agreed to raise £6,000 for the expense of the voyage, and the colonel and the captain were to have a fifth of the profits of the whole undertaking. This plan was so highly approved of by King William, who thought it would produce such great advantages to his subjects, that he promised to contribute to its success, and therefore a referve was agreed to be made of a 10th part of the effects feized from the pirates for the ufe of his Majefty. But after the contract was concluded, the king could not fpare his fhare of the money, and therefore the whole was advanced by the above mentioned perfons. Matters being thus far adjusted, a commiffion in the ufual form was granted to Captain Kidd to take and feize pirates, and bring them to juftice. But there was no fpecial claufe or proviso to reftrain his conduct, or to regulate the mode of his proceeding. Kidd was known to Lord Bellomont, and another gentleman prefented him to Lord Romney. With regard to the other parties concerned, he was wholly unacquainted with them, and fo ill was this affair conducted, that he had no private inftruction how to act, but received his failing orders from Lord Bellomont, the purport of which was, that he fhould act agreeable to the letter of his commiffion. Accordingly, a veffel was purchafed and manned, and received the name of the Adventure Galley, and in this Captain Kidd failed from New York towards the clofe of the year 1695, and in his paffage made a prize of a French fhip. From New York he failed to the Madeira Iflands, thence to Buenavisto and St. Jago, and from this laft place to Madagascar. He now began to cruize at the entrance of the Red Sea, but not being fuccefsful in thofe latitudes, he failed to Calicut, and there took a fhip of 150 tons burden, which he carried to Madagascar, and was difpofed of there. Having fold his prize, he again put to fea, and at the expiration of 5 weeks took the Quetta Merchant, a fhip of above 400 tons burden, the mafter of which was an Englishman named Wright, who had 2 Dutch mates on board, and a French gunner, but the crew confifted of Moors, natives of Africa, and were about 90 in number. He carried the fhip to St. Mary's, near Madagascar, where he burnt the Adventure Galley belonging to his owners, and divided the lading of the Quetta Merchant with his crew, taking 40 fhares to himfelf. They then went on board the laft mentioned fhip, and failed for the Weft Indies. It is uncertain whether the inhabitants of the Weft Indian Iflands knew that Kidd was a pirate, but he was refufed refrefhments at Anguilla and St. Thomas's, and therefore failed to Mona, between Porto Rico and Hispaniola, where, through the management of an Englishman named Bolton, he obtained a fupply of provifions from Curacao. He now bought a floop of Bolton, in which he flowed greater part of his ill-gotten effects, and left the Quetta Merchant with 18 of the fhip's company in Bolton's care. While at St. Mary's, 90 men of Kidd's crew left him, and went on board the Mooka Merchant, an East India fhip which had juft then commenced pirate. Kidd now failed the floop, and touched at feveral places, where he difpofed of a great part of his cargo, and then fteered for Bofton in New England. In the interim, Bolton fold the Quetta Merchant to the Spaniards, and immediately failed as a paflenger in a fhip to Bofton, where he arrived a confiderable time before Kidd, and gave information of what happened to Lord Bellomont, then the resident governor. Kidd therefore on his arrival was feized by order of his lordfhip, when all he had to urge in his defence was that he thought that the Quetta Merchant was a lawful prize, as fhe was manned with Moors, though there was no kind of proof that this veffel had committed any act of piracy. Upon this the Earl of Bellomont immediately difpatched an account to England of the circumftances that had arifen, and requested that a fhip might be fent for Kidd, who had committed feveral other notorious acts of piracy. The fhip Rochester was accordingly fent to bring him to England, but this veffel happening to be disabled, was obliged to return, a circumftance which greatly increafed a public clamour which had for fome time fubfifted refpecting this affair. It is not to be doubted but that this clamour took its rife from party prejudice. Yet it was carried to fuch a height, that the members of Parliament for feveral places were inftructed to move the Houfe for an inquiry into the affair, and accordingly it was moved in the Houfe of Commons that "the letters patent granted to the Earl of Bellomont and others, respecting the goods taken from pirates, were dishonourable to the King, against the law of nations, contrary to the laws and statutes of this realm, an invasion of property, and destructive to commerce." Though a negative was put on this motion, yet the enemies of Lord Somers and the Earl of Oxford continued to charge thofe noblemen with giving countenance to pirates, and it was even insinuated that the Earl of Bellomont was no lefs culpable than the actual offenders. Another motion was accordingly made in the Houfe of Commons to addrefs his Majefty that "Kidd might not be tried till the next feffion of Parliament, and that the Earl of Bellomont might be directed to fend home all examinations and other papers relative to this affair." This motion was carried, and the King complied with the requeft which was made. As foon as Kidd arrived in England, he was fent for and examined at the bar of the Houfe of Commons, with a view to fix part of his guilt on the parties who had been concerned in fending him on the expedition; but nothing arofe to criminate any of thofe diftinguifhed perfons. Kidd, who was in fome degree intoxicated, made a very contemptible appearance at the bar of the Houfe; on which a member, who had been one of the moft earneft to have him examined, violently exclaimed, "Damn this fellow, I thought he had been only a knave, but unfortunately he happens to be a fool likewife." Kidd was at length tried at the Old Bailey, and was convicted on the cleareft evidence, but neither at that time nor afterwards charged any of his employers with being privy to his infamous proceedings. He was hanged at Execution Dock on the 23rd day of May, 1701, but a circumftance happened at his execution that will be worthy of recital. After he had been tied up to the gallows, the rope broke, and he fell to the ground; but being immediately tied up again, the ordinary, who had before exhorted him, desired to speak with him once more, and on his fecond application entreated him to make the moft careful ufe of the few farther moments thus providentially allotted him for the final preparation of a foul to meet its important change. Thefe exhortations appeared to have the wifhed for effect, and he was left profeffing his charity to all the world, and his hopes of falvation through the merits of his Redeemer. In this manner ended the life of Captain Kidd, a man who, if he had entertained a proper regard to the welfare of the public, or even to his own advantage, might have become a ufeful member of society, inftead of a difgrace to it. The opportunities he had obtained of acquiring a complete knowledge of the haunts of the pirates rendered him one of the moft proper men in the world to have extirpated this nest of villains; but his own avarice defeated the generous views of fome of the greatest and moft diftinguished men of the age in which he lived. Hence we may learn the destructive nature of avarice, which generally counteracts all of its own purposes. Captain Kidd might have acquired a fortune, and rendered material fervice to his country in point of the moft effential interest; but he appeared to be dead to all thofe generous fenfations which do honour to humanity, and materially injured his country while he was bringing final difgrace on himfelf. The hiftory of this wretched malefactor will effectually imprefs on the mind of the reader the truth of the old obfervation, that "honefty is the beft policy." Henceforth let honour's path be trod, nor villains feek in vain To mock the facred laws of God, and give their neighbours pain. Account of the Parentage, Life, Execution, &c. of Herman Strodtman, who fuffered at Tyburn for the murder of Peter Wolter. Henry Strodtman, who came of a good family, was born in Revel in Leefland, about the year 1683. His parents, who were of a religious disposition gave him a liberal and pious education. He was sent by his father to school at Lubeck in the year 1694, where he remained till Michaelmas 1698. At this period he went to Hamburg, where he continued fome months, and then, in company with a young countryman of his, named Peter Wolter, embarked for England; and on their arrival in London they were both bound apprentices to Messrs. Stein and Dorien, merchants and partners. Both thefe young gentlemen lived together in great harmony for a considerable time, but in the month of Auguft preceding the fatal tragedy, of which we are about to recite the particulars, Mr. Dorien was married to the fifter of Peter Wolter. Hereupon the latter began to affume airs of confequence, and behaved with fo much insolence to Strodtman, that his pride took the alarm. They had feveral quarrels, and Wolter beat Strodtman twice, at one time in the counting houfe, and at another before the fervant girls in the kitchen. Wolter likewife traduced Strodtman to his matters, who thereupon denied him the liberty and other gratifications that were allowed his fellow prentice. Hereupon Strodtman conceived an implacable hatred against him, and resolved to murder him in fome way or other. His first intention was to have poifoned him, and with this view he mixed fome white mercury with the white powder which Wolter ufed to keep in a glafs in his bed room as a remedy for the fcurvy. But this happening to be done in the midft of winter, Wolter had declined taking the powder, fo that the other thought of destroying him by the more expeditious method of ftabbing. This fcheme, however, was delayed from time to time, while Wolter's pride and arrogance increafed to fuch a degree, that the other thought he fhould at length be tempted to murder him in fight of the family. Hereupon Strodtman desired one of the maids to intimate to his matters his inclination to be fent to the Weft Indies. But no anfwer being given to his requefts, Strodtman grew fo uneafy, and his enmity against his fellow prentice increafed to fuch a degree, that the Dutch maid, obferving the agitation of his mind, advifed him to a patient fubmiffion to this fituation, as the moft probable method of fecuring his future peace. Unfortunately he paid no regard to this good advice, but determined on the execution of the fatal plan which afterwards led to his deftruction. On the morning of Good Friday Strodtman was fent out on bufinefs, but, inftead of tranfacting it, he went to Greenwich, with an intention of returning on Saturday to perpetrate the murder. But reflecting that his fellow prentice was to receive the Sacrament on Eafter Sunday, he abhorred the thought of taking away his life before he had partaken of the Lord's Supper. Wherefore he fent a letter to his matters on the Saturday, in which he afferted that he had been impreffed, and was to be fent to Chatham on Eafter Monday, and put on board a fhip in the Royal Navy. But while he was at Greenwich, he was met by a young gentleman who knew him, and who, returning to London, told Messrs. Stein and Dorien he believed the story of his being impressed was all invention. Hereupon Mr. Stein went to Chatham to enquire into the real ftate of the cafe, when he discovered that the young gentleman's fufpicions were all too well founded. Strodtman went to the church at Greenwich twice on Eafter Sunday, and on the approach of evening came to London, and flept at the Dolphin Inn in Bishopsgate Street. On the following day he returned to Greenwich, and continued either at that place or at Woolwich, and at the neighbourhood till Tuefday, when he went to London, lodged in Lombard Street, and returned to Greenwich on Wednesday. Coming again to London on the evening of the fucceeding day, he did not return any more to Greenwich, but going to the houfe of his matter, he told them that what he had written was true, for he had been preffed. They gave no credit to this tale, but told him they had enquired into the affair, and bid him quit their houfe. This he did, and took lodging in Moorfields, where he lay on that and the following night, and on the Saturday he took other lodgings at the Sun in Queen Street, London. Before the preceding Chriftmas he had procured a key on the model of that belonging to his mafter's houfe, that he might go in and out at pleafure. Originally he intended to have made no worfe ufe of this key, but it being ftill in his poffeffion, he let himfelf into the houfe between 8 and 9 o'clock on the evening of the Saturday laft mentioned; but hearing footfteps of fome perfons going up ftairs, he concealed himfelf behind the door in the paffage. As foon as the noife arifing from the circumftance was over, he went up a pair of ftairs to the room adjoining the counting houfe, where he ufed to fleep, and having found a tinder box, he lighted a candle and put it into his mafter's dark lanthorn, which he carried up ftairs to an empty room next to that in which Peter Wolter ufed to lay. Here he continued a fhort time, when hearing fomebody coming up ftairs, he put out his candle, and fell afleep foon afterwards. Awaking about 12 o'clock, he liftened for a while, and hearing no noife, he imagined that the whole family were fast afleep. Hereupon he descended to the room on the firft floor where the tinder box lay, and having lighted his candle, he went to the counting houfe, and took a fum of money and feveral bills and notes. This being done, he took a piece of wood with which he ufed to beat tobacco, and going up ftairs again, he haftily entered the room where Peter Wolter was afleep, and advancing to his bedfide, ftruck him violently on the head, and though his heart in fome degree failed him, yet he continued his ftrokes. As the wounded youth groaned much, he took a pillow and lay it on his mouth, fat down on the fide of the bed, and preffed it hard with his elbows, till no appearance of life remained. Perceiving Wolter to be quite dead, he fearched his cheft of drawers and pockets, and took as much money as, what he had taken from his masters, amounted to above £8. He then packed up fome linen and woollen clothes, and going down one pair of ftairs, he threw his bundle into a houfe that was uninhabited. He then went up ftairs again, and having cut his candle, lighted both pieces, one of which he placed in a chair clofe to the bed curtains, and the other on a cheft of drawers, with a view to have fet the houfe on fire to conceal the robbery and murder of which he had been guilty. This being done, he went through a window into the houfe where he had thrown his bundle, and in this place he stayed till 5 in the morning, when he took the bundle with him to his lodgings in Queen Street, where he fhifted his apparel, and went to the Swedish church in Trinity Lane. After the worfhip of the congregation had ended, he heard a bill of thanks read, which his mafters had fent, in devout acknowledgment of their narrow efcape themfelves and their neighbours had experienced from the fire. Struck by this circumftance, Strodtman burft into tears, but he endeavoured as much as poffible to conceal his emotions from a gentleman who fat in the fame pew with him, and who, on their coming out of the church, informed him that the houfe of Messrs. Stein and Dorien narrowly efcaped being burnt the preceding night by an accident then unknown, but that the deftruction was providentially prevented by the Dutch maid fmelling the fire and feeing the fmoke, fo that on her alarming her mafter, the flames were extinguifhed with a pail of water. Strodtman made an appointment to meet the gentleman who gave him this information on the outer walks of the Royal Exchange in the afternoon, to go to the Dutch church in the Savoy; but the gentleman not coming to this time, he went alone to Stepney church, and after fervice was ended he walked towards Mile End, where he faw the 2 Dutchmen, thefe muft have been Michael Van Bergen and his fervant Dromulus, who had been hung in chains. This fight gave him a fhocking idea of the crime of which he had been guilty, and he reflected that he might foon become a like horrid fpectacle to mankind. Hence he proceeded to Blackwall, where he faw the captain of a French pirate hanging in chains, which gave frefh force to the gloomy feelings of his mind, and again taught him to dread a fimilar fate. After having been thus providentially led to the fight of objects which he would otherwife rather have avoided, he returned to his lodgings in great dejection of mind, but far from repenting, or even being properly fensible of the crime he had committed, for, as he himself said, his heart did not yet repent for what he had done, and if he had failed murdering his fellow prentice in his bed, he should have destroyed him some other way. On his return to his lodgings he ate supper, said his prayers, and went to bed. On the following morning he went to the White Horse Inn without Cripplegate to receive cash for a bill of £20 which he had stolen from his master's house. But the person who was to have paid it being gone out, he was desired to call again about 12 o'clock. In the interim he went to the house of a banker in Lombard Street, who requested him to carry some money for the banker's sister, who was at a boarding school in Greenwich. Stodman said he could not go till the following day, when he would execute the commission. But before he left the house of the banker, he told him that a young man named Green had been to enquire for him, on which Stodman said that if Mr. Green returned, he should be informed that he would come back again at 1 o'clock. Hence he went again to the White Horse Inn, where he found the party, who told him that he had no orders to pay the money for the bill. Having received this answer, he went to his lodgings, where he dined, and then went to the banker's in Lombard Street, where his master, Stein, with Mr. Green and another gentleman, were waiting for him. Mr. Stein asked him if he would go willingly to his house, or be carried thither by porters, and he replied that he would go of his own accord. When he came there, he was asked some questions respecting the atrocious crimes which he had been guilty of; but, persisting that he was innocent, he was searched, and the £20 bill found in his possession. They then inquired where he lodged, to which he answered Moor Fields. Whereupon they all went thither together, but the people denied his lodging there at that time. Mr. Stein, finding him unwilling to speak the truth, told him that if he would make a full discovery, he would be sent abroad out of the reach of justice. Thereupon he mentioned his real lodgings, on which they went thither in a coach, and finding the bills and other stolen effects, Stodman was carried before Sir Humphrey Edwin, who committed him to Newgate on his own confession. He was not tried at the first sessions after his commitment, and in the interval that he lay in prison some bad people who were confined there trumped up an idle tale for him to tell when he came to trial, and prevailed on him to plead not guilty, a circumstance which he afterwards sincerely repented of. On his trial, however, there were so many corroborative proofs of his guilt, that the jury could not hesitate to convict him, and he received the sentence awarded by law. While he was under sentence of death, his behaviour was remarkably contrite and penitent, and when the ordinary of Newgate told him that the warrant of his execution was come down, and that he would suffer in a few days, he said, "The Lord's will be done. I am willing to die, only I beg of God that I may not, as I deserve, die an eternal death, and that though I die here for my most heinous and enormous crimes, yet I may, for the love of Christ, live eternally with him in heaven. God bless the King and all my honourable judges. They have done me no wrong, but 'tis I have done great wrong. The Lord be merciful to me, a great sinner, else I perish." At times he seemed to despair, because he feared that his repentance was not equal to his guilt. But then again his mind was occasionally warmed with the hope that his penitence was such as would lead to salvation. When at the place of execution he acknowledged his crime, for which he professed the sincerest sorrow and repentance. He begged pardon of God for having endeavoured, with presumptuous lies, to conceal thofe crimes, which being punifhed in this world, his eternal punishment in the next might be avoided. He died full of contrition, penitence, and hope, and suffered at Tyburn on the 18th of June, 1701, and it was remarked that he kept his hands lifted up for a considerable time after the cart was drawn away. This is the end of Volume 1, Part 2 of the New and Complete Newgate Calendar.